That's our new community clubhouse." That's exactly what HOA President Karen screamed at me. Her face was bright red, and she was waving a rolled-up HOA newsletter like a weapon. She had stormed right past my no trespassing sign, straight onto the porch of the 100-year-old mansion I had just legally bought. "You can't do this," she yelled, her voice cracking with outrage. "This property is abandoned. It belongs to the community. We had plans for this building." I didn't move. I just leaned against the railing, watching her flail around like she was auditioning for a soap opera. What Karen didn't know, in her blind, entitled rage, was that I knew all about her plans. I knew she was planning to use HOA funds to seize this abandoned property, claiming it was a hazard. I knew she planned to renovate it using her brother's construction company, the same company that magically doubled every invoice. And I knew she was going to turn this so-called community clubhouse into a private wedding venue with every dollar of profit funneling neatly into her own pocket. She thought I was just some random guy who got lucky. What she really didn't know was that I'm a forensic accountant. A quiet one. The kind of guy people overlook at meetings until I start talking numbers. And numbers, unlike people, don't lie. I had just used my boring research skills to find a 150-year-old, forgotten tax lien buried in city records. Not just any lien, a 10-cent sewage bill from 1925. According to an obscure municipal law that no one had touched in over a century, if that lien wasn't paid and filed, anyone could claim the property after the legal waiting period. So I followed every step. I paid the 10 cents, filed the paperwork, and held the deed in my hands. I hadn't just bought this mansion. I had legally acquired it for 10 cents. The Hawthorne estate stood tall behind me, its weathered walls covered in ivy and thyme. The wooden porch creaked under my boots, and the early morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The place looked haunted, the kind of house kids dared each other to touch on Halloween. But to me, it was beautiful. History wrapped in mystery. Karen didn't see that, though. To her, everything was about control. She was the type who treated HOA bylaws like commandments and believed the world existed to follow her rules. She took a step closer, close enough that I could see the sweat collecting on her temple. "You think this is funny? You think you can just waltz in here and take over our property?" I smiled lightly. "Not funny, Karen. Just legal." Her nostrils flared. "I'll have you removed. I'll call the city, the police, the HOA attorneys." "Do that," I interrupted softly. "Tell them Arthur Simmons is trespassing on his own property." Her mouth snapped shut for half a second. Then she pointed her rolled-up newsletter at me like a sword. "You'll regret this." And then she spun around and marched down the path, muttering under her breath. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her heels fading into the distance. The air grew still again. Somewhere nearby, a crow cawed, fitting really. I looked up at the cracked windows of the mansion and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. 10 cents, I said quietly to myself. The best deal of my life. But deep down, I knew what was coming. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She'd come back, louder, meaner, and backed by every bit of false authority she could muster. She'd fine me, slander me, maybe even try to sue me. And that was fine. Because I wasn't just ready for her. I expected her. What she didn't understand was that I'd already mapped out her entire game. Every lie, every forged signature, every inflated contract her brother ever submitted. She thought she could bury the truth under paperwork. But I lived in paperwork. And when the time came, when she finally tried to rally the community against me at that big HOA meeting, I'd be waiting. Collected. With receipts. Because people like Karen shout. And people like me? We prove. So I turned back toward the heavy oak door, slid my key into the lock, and twisted it open. The hinges groaned like an old man stretching after a long nap. The air inside smelled like dust, wood, and secrets. I stepped over the threshold and smiled. "Welcome home," I whispered. That was the moment it all began. The war Karen started, and the one I quietly planned to finish. And trust me, when I did, her downfall was just as loud as her entrance. The air inside the mansion still smelled of dust and old wood when I first stepped in, but before I tell you how this all spiraled into a neighborhood war, let me take you back to where it started, long before Karen stormed up that porch, screaming about community property. My name's Arthur Simmons. I'm a semi-retired forensic accountant. Basically, I spent 30 years tracking down financial lies for a living, corporate fraud, fake invoices, offshore accounts, the kind of stuff that puts people in orange jumpsuits. These days, I prefer quiet puzzles. Old records, forgotten laws, dusty archives, the kind of details no one else cares about but me. After decades of staring at spreadsheets, all I wanted was peace. A small, neat neighborhood. That's why I moved here, Maplewood Hills. On the surface, it looked perfect. But like most things that look perfect, it had rot under the paint. And that rot had a name, Karen. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. You couldn't miss her. The short blonde haircut, the clipboard clutched like a weapon, and that sharp perfume. She didn't walk, she marched. Always on a mission to maintain standards. At first, I thought she was just overly enthusiastic. But then I started hearing stories. Mrs. Olson, a woman in her 70s, got fined $150 because she planted yellow tulips instead of approved white ones. A veteran's truck was threatened with towing because a faded bumper sticker lowered property values. She ran the HOA like a dictator with a smile. People were afraid of her. I stayed quiet. I paid my dues and kept my lawn neat. She didn't bother me. But Karen wasn't the reason I moved here. Emily was. My late wife, Emily, grew up in this town, and she loved its history. She was a local historian, and I was her boring accountant. Our story actually started right here. On our first real date, she didn't want a fancy dinner. She brought me to the top of this hill with a picnic basket, and we looked at the old, abandoned Hawthorne estate. She told me all its secrets. Built in 1923. The builder went broke. She saw the beauty under the dust. I just saw the bad numbers. I remember her laughing, pointing at the cracked porch. Arthur, she said, promise me. If we ever make it big, let's buy this place. Let's save it. It became our joke, our dream. When I lost her 3 years ago, all I wanted was to be somewhere she had loved. So I moved to Maplewood Hills. I stayed quiet. But every time I drove past that old mansion, I felt that promise. It wasn't just a hobby. It was a mission. I started digging into the mansion's records, not as a historian, but as a forensic accountant. I wanted to see if saving it was even possible. I expected to find millions in debt. That's when I found it, buried deep in the 1925 county records. The ink was faded, but the words were still clear. Outstanding sewage lien, 10 cents, Hawthorne Estate. 10 cents. Unpaid. My heart stopped. It couldn't be that simple. But I kept digging. I cross-referenced city ordinances, municipal codes, and legal archives. That's when I found it, a forgotten city law from 1874. It stated that any property with an unpaid original utility lien could be reclaimed by anyone who paid the amount in full and followed the city's public notice procedures. I couldn't believe it. The law was ancient, but it was still on the books. It wasn't buried treasure. It felt like a gift. So I decided to test it. I submitted a public claim form, paid the original lien amount, 10 cents, and filed the documents through the proper county channels. Every step, every signature, every record, airtight. A few weeks later, I got a call from the county clerk. Her voice was amused but official. Mr. Simmons, she said, congratulations. According to our records, you are now the legal owner of the Hawthorne estate. I remember holding that deed in my hands. It felt surreal. A property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it was mine. It wasn't just a property. It was a promise kept. I didn't tell anyone at first. I just smiled to myself. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was restoring a memory. But then, I mentioned it casually at a small neighborhood meeting. I thought it'd make people smile. Karen didn't smile. Not even close. Her eyes went wide, then narrowed like a hawk. "You mean the Hawthorne estate?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "It's been abandoned for years, but I found an old law." She cut me off. "That property belongs to the community. We've been planning to repurpose it for years. You can't just claim it." I remember the way she said, "community," like it meant me. I just shrugged and said, "Well, the city disagrees." That's when I saw it, the spark, that flicker of fury behind her polite smile. It was the moment she realized she couldn't control something she thought was hers. From that moment, I knew trouble was coming. I just didn't realize how far she'd go. But honestly, I wasn't scared. I'd spent years dealing with people who lied for a living. Karen was just another one, louder, but predictable. And I had something she didn't, the truth. And now, I also had a promise to keep. Have you ever met someone who thought they owned the entire neighborhood? The kind who acts like they're mayor, judge, and God all rolled into one? Let me know in the comments, because I was about to meet the worst of them. A woman whose ego was about to clash with a man who had receipts. And as I drove toward the mansion for the first time, with the deed in my glove box and 10 cents still sitting on my dashboard as a reminder, I had no idea that my quiet life was about to turn into a full-blown war. The kind fought not with fists, but with facts. I was halfway up the porch steps when I heard the sharp sound of heels clicking against the cracked driveway. I looked up, and there she was. Karen, clipboard in hand, marching like she owned the place. "That's our new community clubhouse," she yelled, her voice slicing through the quiet air like a siren. I froze, still holding the new lock I was about to install. Her face was bright red, and she was waving a rolled-up HOA newsletter like it was a sword. "This property belongs to Maplewood Hills," she barked. "You can't just walk in here." I kept my voice calm. "Actually, I can. I'm the new owner." She blinked like I'd just told her the sky was green. "The owner?" she repeated. "That's impossible. This building is under HOA review. We already filed plans for its redevelopment." I could tell she wasn't here to listen. She was here to control. I opened my folder and handed her a copy of the deed. "It's all legal. You can confirm it with the county office." She didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, she took a deep breath, folded her arms, and gave me that condescending smile I'd seen her use on other neighbors, the one that said, "You'll regret this." "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, Arthur," she said. "But forging legal documents? That's a serious crime. I could have the police here in 10 minutes. I just smiled. "Go ahead. They'll probably want to see my paperwork too." Her eyes narrowed. For a second, I thought she might actually swing that newsletter at me. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched away, shouting over her shoulder, "You'll be hearing from the HOA." And she meant it. By that evening, my mailbox had its first gift, a bright orange envelope stamped "Urgent Notice." According to the letter, I was in violation of community guidelines for unauthorized construction activity. Construction. Apparently, changing a lock now counted as a renovation. I laughed and tossed it aside. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, a second letter appeared. This one claimed I had unapproved landscaping debris on my property. I looked around. The only debris was the pile of leaves that had been sitting there since before I owned the place. By the third letter, I stopped laughing. Each notice was signed by HOA President Karen Whitfield, printed in bold like she wanted to make sure I didn't forget who was behind it. It was almost impressive, the speed at which she weaponized bureaucracy. But what she didn't know was I'd spent 30 years fighting bigger sharks than her. People who thought intimidation worked until a spreadsheet proved otherwise. I decided not to react. I went about my work quietly, cleaning out old rooms, changing locks, sweeping the porch. I figured if I stayed calm, she'd eventually move on. Instead, she escalated. 3 days later, someone left a note under my door. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper that said, "Scammers like you aren't welcome here." The handwriting looked rushed, probably one of her loyal followers, trying to impress their queen. That same night, I noticed something new on the neighborhood bulletin board near the park. A printed post titled, "Community Alert." It warned residents about a man posing as the owner of the Hawthorne estate. The post said I was under police investigation for property fraud. My name was right there in black and white. I remember standing there under the streetlight, reading that ridiculous piece of paper, and feeling this strange mix of anger and pity. Anger, because she was slandering me publicly. Pity, because she genuinely thought she could win a war of facts with lies. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Not with shouting. That's her language, not mine. I walked to her house, neat lawn, white shutters, and 3 different Community Pride stickers on the mailbox. She opened the door before I even knocked. "Arthur," she said flatly, "I'm very busy." "I'm sure you are," I replied, "but I need you to take down the false notice from the community board." She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "False? Oh, I wouldn't say that. We're simply warning residents about potential fraud." "Karen," I said evenly, "you know that's defamation. You've seen the deed." "I don't recognize forged documents," she said, crossing her arms. "Until this is resolved legally, that property is HOA managed." That was the first time she said those words, "AM managed." It was her way of pretending ownership she didn't have. I took a slow breath. "You're overstepping." She leaned forward slightly, whispering like she was letting me in on a secret. "Arthur, you don't understand how things work around here. The HOA decides what's best for the community, not some outsider with a hobby in paperwork." I smiled. Then maybe it's time the community saw what best for them really looks like. Her expression flickered. For just a second, she looked uncertain. But she recovered quickly and slammed the door in my face. That was fine by me. Because I wasn't fighting her in the streets, I was fighting her with records, timestamps, and laws she didn't even know existed. Still, even knowing that, it was exhausting. Every day seemed to bring a new letter, a new complaint, a new lie. And I could see how this kind of bullying might work on others. That's how she ruled, by wearing people down until they stopped resisting. But I wasn't built that way. One afternoon, I caught 2 HOA board members standing near the mansion gate, whispering. They quickly walked off when they saw me. An hour later, I found a fresh notice taped to the rusted iron bars. "Property under HOA management. Trespassing prohibited." I stared at it for a long moment, the paper fluttering in the wind. My name wasn't on it, just an official-looking stamp and Karen's signature. I could almost hear her voice in my head, smug and certain. "Let's see him ignore this." For a few seconds, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, that deep, quiet burn of righteous anger. The kind that doesn't make you shout. The kind that makes you plan. I peeled the notice off the gate and folded it neatly. Then I walked back inside, sat down at the dusty kitchen table, and opened my laptop. If Karen wanted to play games with bylaws, I'd show her how they really worked. I started compiling everything, every false notice, every defamatory post, every violation of HOA procedure. I even took photos of her official notices taped to my private property. Each one, time-stamped and logged. It wasn't just about proving her wrong anymore. It was about exposing what she was doing, not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood she'd been manipulating for years. That night, as I looked out from the cracked window of the mansion, I could see Karen's house down the street. Lights still on, probably her writing another angry email. I smiled to myself. This wasn't about rules. It never was. This was about power, and she wasn't used to someone she couldn't intimidate. She thought she could bury me under paperwork and rumors. But what she didn't realize was, she just declared a war on the one person who knew how to dig through every lie she'd ever written. And as I sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the old house, I whispered to myself, "All right, Karen. Let's see how well your empire holds up against the truth." Because she might have had the HOA behind her, but I had something much stronger, proof. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't just a fight for a mansion. It was a fight for the truth, and I was just getting started. The next morning, the world felt quiet. Too quiet. I was out front, trimming the overgrown grass near the porch steps, when I saw a police cruiser roll to a slow stop by the curb. 2 officers stepped out, one tall, one short, both polite in that professional way that instantly tells you something's wrong. "Morning," the tall one said, glancing down at a clipboard. "Are you Arthur Bennett?" I nodded, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "That's me." "Something wrong, officers?" He looked uncomfortable. "We got a report about a possible property dispute. Something about forged ownership documents." For a second, I just stared. Then it hit me, of course, Karen. I almost laughed. "Let me guess. HOA complaint." They exchanged a look that told me I was right. "Would you mind showing us some paperwork?" the shorter officer asked. "We just need to verify ownership. Standard procedure." "Of course," I said calmly. "Give me a minute." Inside, I grabbed my folder, the same one I had shown Karen days ago, complete with the county stamp deed, tax receipts, and notarized transfer. I handed it to them on the porch, watching as they flipped through it. Their expressions shifted from suspicion to relief. The tall officer closed the folder and handed it back. "Looks like everything's in order, sir. Sorry for the trouble." "No trouble," I said with a small smile. "You're just doing your job." He nodded. "Between you and me, sir, this happens more than you'd think. I just can get a little overzealous." I finished. He chuckled. "That's one word for it." They left soon after, and I watched their cruiser disappear down the street. My hands were steady, but inside, something burned. Not fear. Not anger. Just that cold, clean spark of realization. Karen had crossed the line. She hadn't just spread rumors or taped fake notices. She had called the police on me. She tried to brand me a criminal. I went back to mowing, the hum of the old push mower filling the silence, but the thought wouldn't leave me. I could picture her sitting in her kitchen, dialing that number, probably smiling to herself, thinking she'd finally scared me off. She had no idea what she'd just done. Because once someone crosses that line, you stop defending. You start preparing. The next few days were a blur of noise, literal and political. Every morning, there was something new taped to my gate. Fines for unauthorized maintenance. Warnings for unapproved structural alterations. All eyes. All signed by HOA President Karen Whitfield. I started photographing them as they came. Every small detail mattered. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Karen's poison was working, but she wasn't satisfied with just rumors. She had been humiliated by the police. She needed to escalate. I thought she had gone quiet. I was wrong. That night, I was in my apartment, not the mansion, when my phone buzzed at 3:15 a.m. It was the new security system I had installed at the Hawthorne estate. Motion detected at the front porch. I pulled up the live feed, my heart pounding. The night vision was grainy, but I could see a figure in a dark hoodie. Before I could even hit the record button, the figure picked up a large rock from the overgrown garden. The sound of the original, 100-year-old stained glass window over the front door shattering was so loud it distorted the audio. The figure threw another rock and another. Then they ran. They were gone in seconds. I called the police again and drove over. By the time I arrived, the damage was done. The entire front porch was covered in glittering, broken glass. Rocks were sitting in the grand entryway, and taped to one of the rocks was a new handwritten note. It didn't have an official stamp. It was just jagged, angry letters in red ink. It said, "Condor, Ruins, Ko Jira Dina Chahi." This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. This was a criminal act. This was violence. She had crossed a line, and she had no idea what she had just woken up. She had just attacked the memory of my wife. That night, I sat at my desk, not at the mansion, but at my home office. The police report for the vandalism sat next to me. My hands weren't shaking with anger. They were perfectly still, focused. She thought she could scare me off, like she scared Mrs. Olson over her tulips. She thought she was just fighting a quiet, retired old man. She had no idea she just declared war on a forensic accountant. She had forced my hand. It was time to move from defense to offense. I sat at my desk with my laptop open, files spread around me like a general's war table. I started digging deeper, not just at the HOA level. I went deeper. Public issue filings, board meeting minutes, and, most importantly, tax records from the county clerk's office. I wasn't just looking for mistakes. I was looking for patterns. And there they were. Payments to her brother's construction company, listed as community maintenance. Inflated invoices for projects that never happened. Checks approved with Karen's signature. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was theft, quiet, subtle, and long-running, all hidden behind the smiling mask of community improvement. By midnight, I had enough evidence to make even the calmest person furious. But instead of anger, I felt clarity. She thought I was just a hobbyist who stumbled onto a lucky loophole. She had no idea she'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent decades tracking corporate fraud. I sat back, staring at the glowing laptop screen, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. She'd forced me into this. But now I was exactly where I was strongest. Outside, the wind howled through the old trees, rattling the broken shutters. I whispered into the still air, "You've had your fun, Karen. My turn." The next morning, I didn't hide. I worked openly in the yard, this time boarding up the broken windows. Every swing of the hammer felt like a small act of defiance. And sure enough, I saw her, standing across the street in her pristine white jacket, arms crossed, phone in hand, glaring like a queen. For the first time, I met her eyes and didn't look away. She scowled, muttered something into her phone, and stomped back toward her house. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew what she'd say. "We'll handle him at the next HOA meeting." But I was counting on it, because what she didn't realize was that every attack, every false letter, every broken window had given me exactly what I needed. Proof, dates, signatures, and most of all, intent. She'd built her own noose, and all I had to do was show the world the rope. That night, I closed my laptop and sat quietly by the window. The mansion groaned softly in the wind, the air thick with the smell of old wood and something else, resolve. I wasn't just cleaning up an old house anymore. I was building a case. And as I looked out across the dark street, toward Karen's glowing windows, I said it out loud this time, slowly, clearly, so even the walls could hear. When someone crosses the line that boldly, you stop defending. You start preparing. And I was more than prepared. I was ready. The next morning wasn't calm. It was cold. I stood on the porch of the mansion at 6 a.m. The air was sharp. I was staring at the jagged, empty holes where the 100-year-old stained glass windows had been. The sound of glass shattering at 3 a.m. was still ringing in my ears. Karen had crossed a line. She had moved from paper threats to physical violence. That note, "Ruins should be demolished," wasn't just vandalism. It was a promise. She was trying to physically destroy the memory of my wife, Emily. This wasn't about HOA bylaws anymore. This was criminal. I went back to my home office. The HOA nonsense binder felt too polite now. She thought she could scare me off by breaking a few windows. She had no idea what she had just woken up. She had declared war on a forensic accountant. It was time to stop defending. It was time to attack. My office was no longer a workspace. It was a battlefield. Ye AP ka majuda script hi jo a bilkul fit HOA hi. Every file, every printed letter, every notice she taped to my gate, I cataloged them all. I didn't just take pictures. I documented everything. Dates, stamps, signatures. Even the smudge of ink from the morning dew. Because in my world, the smallest details told the biggest stories. I created folders on my laptop labeled Evidence, Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. It looked less like a hobbyist project and more like a federal audit. And honestly, that's what it had become. I wasn't just protecting a house anymore. I was building a case. Each time I scrolled through another document, I could almost hear my old mentor's voice from my accounting days. Numbers don't lie, Arthur. People do. By the third day, I stopped feeling tired. I felt sharp, alive, like an old machine that had been sitting in storage too long but was finally humming again. Late one night, I logged into the county's public financial portal. HOAs, by law, have to post their financial summaries, budgets, expenses, vendor payments, all of it. Most people never look at them. But I wasn't most people. I scrolled past the usual items, landscaping, trash removal, community events, and then I saw it. Construction and maintenance, $72,000. That was strange. The only maintenance the community had that year was fixing a few broken streetlights. $72,000 for that? No way. I clicked deeper. The vendor name popped up on the screen, Whitfield Contracting Services. I leaned back and stared at it. Whitfield. Karen's last name. Coincidence? Not a chance. I pulled up the company's registration details. Thank you. Public records. The owner, Michael Whitfield. Her brother. And then I saw something even better. A payment entry, just a few months ago, to an LLC named Maple Ridge Events. That one made me pause. A quick search later, I was staring at the registration page. Registered owner, Karen L. Whitfield. It all clicked at once. The clubhouse she'd been ranting about, the renovation fund, the inflated contracts, it was never about improving the community. It was about profit. Her profit. She was planning to funnel HOA money into her brother's construction company, then rent out the community clubhouse through her own LLC. It was a full circle of fraud, neatly disguised as community development. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The kind of long where you don't breathe, you just see the whole puzzle fall into place. I should have felt angry, but I didn't. I felt steady, focused, because now I had her. The next morning, I printed everything. Not just screenshots, official downloads. I made 3 copies, each sealed in a separate folder. One for me, one for my lawyer, and one for the right moment. When I called my old friend Martin, a property lawyer I'd worked with years ago, he picked up on the second ring. Arthur? Haven't heard that name in a while. What have you gotten yourself into this time? I chuckled. You'll laugh when you hear it. I told him everything. The 10-cent loophole. The HOA harassment. The fake fines. Karen. He was quiet for a second, and then I heard him actually laugh. You bought a mansion for 10 cents? Legally, I said, smiling. With paperwork to prove it. Well, I'll be damned, he said. You always had a thing for old records and lost laws. But don't worry, Arthur. I'll take a look. My gut says you're solid. He was right. When we met that afternoon, Martin reviewed the deed and the filings. After 20 minutes of flipping pages and muttering legal terms under his breath, he finally looked up. It's airtight, he said. Your claim is cleaner than most modern transfers. She can shout all she wants, but you're in the clear. Good, I said quietly, because she's not just shouting. She's stealing. I showed him the HOA records, the invoices, the LLC registration. He whistled softly. That's bad. That's real bad. You realize what you found here? I nodded. A pattern. He grinned. A pattern that's about to explode. We sat there, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, as I laid out my plan. Karen had already announced an upcoming HOA general meeting. On the agenda, a $50,000 legal defense fund to sue me for fraudulent ownership. I almost laughed when I saw the notice. She had no idea she was about to walk into her own trap. At that meeting, she'd stand in front of everyone and accuse me. And I'd let her. I'd let her rant about how the mansion was stolen, how I was endangering the community. And then, calmly, I'd take out my folders and show everyone what she'd really been doing with their money. The inflated payments. The fake invoices. The secret LLC. Every thread of her corruption, exposed in front of the very people she'd manipulated. That night, I sat alone in the mansion's study, the glow from my desk lamp spilling across the stacks of papers. The air smelled faintly of old oak and rain. For the first time since this began, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was justice. I glanced at the photo of the Hawthorne estate from years ago, back when it was alive, filled with people and laughter. I ran my fingers over the faded edges and smiled. Karen thought she was fighting a retiree with too much time on his hands. But what she'd really done was wake up a man who'd spent a lifetime chasing fraud through numbers and shadows. She played politics. I played proof. And proof always wins. Before heading to bed, I checked my folders one last time. Each document, each photo, each record, perfectly organized. I sealed them in a briefcase and set it by the door. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Martin again to finalize the exhibits. After that, all I had to do was wait for the meeting. Outside, the neighborhood was silent. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Somewhere down the street, a porch light flickered off. I stood at the window watching Karen's house. Her blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint blue glow of a TV. She had no idea that her own paper trail was sitting 30 feet away, waiting to undo her. I took a slow sip of my coffee and smiled. She thought she was at war with a retiree, I murmured, setting the cup down. She didn't realize she'd declared war on a forensic accountant. And this time, I was going to make sure she learned exactly what that meant. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The air felt different, heavy, like the calm before a storm. The HOA meeting was tonight. Karen's grand trial. I made my usual coffee, but this time, I didn't need the caffeine. My nerves were already sharp. My briefcase sat by the door, the documents inside perfectly aligned. My deed, the financial records, the proof. I remember looking out the mansion window. The morning sun had just touched the roof shingles, making the old wood glow gold for the first time in years. It felt symbolic, like the house itself knew what was coming. By evening, the parking lot outside the HOA hall was packed. Cars lined both sides of the street, and people gathered in small groups, whispering. Some waved at me awkwardly. Others avoided my eyes, not sure what to believe. When I walked in, the chatter softened. Karen stood at the front, her usual smugness wrapped in a mask of righteous anger. Her pearl necklace caught the light, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, Arthur," she said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "I was wondering if you'd even show up. Brave of you, considering the legal trouble you're in." I didn't respond. I just smiled politely and took a seat near the back. My lawyer, Martin, gave me a small nod from beside me. Karen rapped the gavel on the podium. "This meeting of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association is now in session," she declared, her voice dripping with importance. "As you all know, we're here to discuss a very serious matter, a matter that threatens the integrity of our entire community." I could almost predict every word before she said it. She'd rehearsed this. She began pacing. "A certain individual," she said, glancing straight at me, "has fraudulently claimed ownership of the old Hawthorne estate, property that was slated for community development. This man," she raised her hand, pointing, "is in possession of fake documents and has trespassed on HOA property." A few gasps echoed through the room. She had them hooked. I sat still, letting her run the show. She needed this moment, her last one. She waved a stack of papers dramatically. That's why I'm proposing we approve a $50,000 legal fund to sue this man and reclaim what's rightfully ours. Applause broke out from a few confused neighbors. Most just looked uneasy. $50,000 was a lot of money. Karen leaned over the podium, lowering her voice for dramatic effect. If we don't act now, we'll lose that land forever. Our community clubhouse, our new pool, all because of one selfish outsider who exploited a loophole. She turned back toward me, eyes gleaming. Arthur, care to defend yourself before we vote? I stood slowly, buttoning my jacket. I appreciate that, Karen, I said calmly. And yes, I'd like to clarify a few things, for the record. The room fell quiet. Karen folded her arms, clearly expecting a weak defense. I walked to the front and placed my briefcase on the table. First, I said, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to show you facts. I opened the laptop and connected it to the projector. The screen lit up behind me, a scan of the official county deed. My name, my signature, the legal stamp. This, I said, is my deed. Filed, verified, and certified by the county clerk's office. The Hawthorne estate is legally mine, not the HOA's, not the community's, not anyone else's. Karen laughed sharply. Oh please, anyone can forge a PDF. I clicked to the next slide, a photo of the county's confirmation letter, complete with the official seal. Then perhaps the county clerk forged this too? I asked gently. A few people chuckled quietly. The mood shifted. I kept going. Now, about this so-called community project. Let's look at the HOA's financial records. The next slide showed a chart, one I'd spent hours preparing. In the past year, your HOA paid $72,000 for something called maintenance. But as we all know, there hasn't been any major construction. I zoomed in on the payment entries. Here's where it gets interesting. The vendor, Whitfield Contracting Services. Owned by Karen's brother, Michael Whitfield. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile faltered. Now, I continued, there's also a $15,000 payment made to an LLC named Maple Ridge Events. Registered owner. I clicked again. Karen L. Whitfield. Guess. Real ones this time. Karen's face turned pale. This is absurd. You're twisting the numbers. Am I? I said softly, clicking one last time. A short audio clip began to play through the speakers. Karen's own voice filled the room. Once the clubhouse is ready, we'll start renting it out for private weddings. That's where the real money is. The HOA will think it's a community project, but will handle the rentals privately. Easy profit. The room erupted. People stood up, shouting questions. You said it was for us. You lied to everyone. You used our money. Karen tried to shout over them. That recording is fake. He's manipulating all of you. But no one was listening anymore. I closed my laptop and looked around the room. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. The truth is loud enough on its own. Martin stood and handed out copies of the official records to the board members. One by one, they scanned through them, their faces turning grim. After a few tense minutes, the HOA vice president, a quiet man named Tom, cleared his throat. Motion to remove Karen Whitfield as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote was fast. Unanimous. Karen slammed her hand on the table. You can't do this. I am the HO. Tom shook his head. Not anymore. Someone from the back shouted, Call the county. This is fraud. Karen tried to grab her papers, but a board member stopped her. She froze, her face trembling with rage and disbelief. As security escorted her out, she turned toward me, her voice cracking. You'll regret this, Arthur. You don't belong here. I just met her gaze and said quietly, I do now. When the doors closed behind her, silence filled the room again. Tom looked at me. Arthur, we owe you an apology. And our thanks. I nodded. No apology needed. Just make sure the books stay clean from now on." He smiled weakly. "You have my word." As I packed up my things, I looked out at the neighbors, people who had once glared at me through their blinds. Now they were smiling, relieved, even clapping. Walking back to the mansion that night, the air felt lighter. The crickets were back. The porch light flickered softly as I stepped inside. I set my briefcase down on the old oak table and took a deep breath. The house creaked around me like it was exhaling too. I didn't feel victorious. I felt right, because the truth had done what it always does. It cut through the lies, clean and quiet. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, raised it toward the ceiling, and whispered, "For 10 cents, not bad." Then I smiled to myself. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than she ever could. When morning came, the world felt quieter. For the first time in months, my phone didn't buzz with HOA notices or lawyer calls. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind the kind of silence that feels earned, the kind that only comes after the truth has spoken. By noon, news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen Whitfield, the woman who once ruled every mailbox, every fence color, every blade of grass, had been charged with embezzlement. The county audit confirmed everything I'd shown at that meeting: the fake invoices, the shell company, the overpayments to her brother's firm. It was all real. And now it was all over. Her brother's construction company was blacklisted from county contracts. The HOA's funds were frozen for investigation. The same neighbors who once nodded fearfully when she passed were now shaking their heads in disbelief as they watched county officers carry out boxes of her records. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need applause. It just needs to be witnessed. A few weeks later, a new HOA election was held. For the first time in years, there was no shouting, no intimidation, no polished speeches filled with fake smiles. People actually listened. They voted in Tom, the quiet vice president who had once sat through Karen's rants with his head down. At the first meeting under his leadership, he stood at the podium and said just one thing that stuck with me. "Let this remind us," he said, "that the loudest voice isn't always the one telling the truth." The room went still. Then they all turned toward me. Tom called me up to the front. "Arthur," he said, his voice steady but warm, "this community owes you more than we can say. You didn't just save the HOA's money. You saved our trust." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was gentle, honest. I smiled and nodded. "All I did," I said quietly, "was pay attention." And that was true. That's all I'd ever done, looked closer, where others didn't bother. After the meeting, I went back to the Hawthorne estate. My mansion. My 10-cent miracle. The air felt lighter now. I opened the tall windows for the first time in years and let the sunlight flood in. Dust particles floated like tiny gold sparks in the air. The floorboards creaked under my feet, but they didn't sound tired anymore. They sounded alive. I started small, fixing the porch railings, sanding the old oak doors, replacing broken tiles with my own hands. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped by, offering help. One of them, a retired painter, offered to restore the original wallpaper in the main hall. Another donated vintage light fixtures from her attic. Soon, the mansion didn't look haunted anymore. It looked historic. I turned one of the upstairs rooms into a small reading library, filled it with old books, history journals, and a corner desk where I could lose myself in research again. On quiet evenings, I'd light the fireplace and read about old city laws, the kind everyone ignores, except people like me. Every time I walked through those halls, I thought about how something so small, a forgotten 10-cent lien, had changed so much. I didn't buy this mansion to start a war. I bought it because I love history. I love the stories buried under dust and neglect. But sometimes history gives you a stage you never asked for and a lesson you're meant to teach. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her greed. It was about what happens when people stop questioning, when they trust the loudest voice instead of the quiet truth. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to heal. Kids started playing on the sidewalks again. Neighbors greeted each other instead of hiding behind fences. The HOA, now transparent and fair, even helped organize a small restoration fundraiser for the mansion. They called it the 10-cent project. At the event, someone asked me, "Arthur, was it worth it? All the trouble, the stress, the fights, just for a house?" I smiled. "It wasn't about the house," I said. "It was about reminding people that fairness still matters, and that greed always pays its price." That night, as the crowd left and the mansion lights dimmed, I stood on the porch, watching the street lights flicker on one by one. The same street where Karen once shouted at me now felt peaceful, balanced. The Hawthorne estate stood tall again, not as a trophy, not as a prize, but as proof that truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone willing to listen for it. I leaned against the porch rail, feeling the breeze move through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter, neighbors, friends, life returning to normal. I raised a glass of that same old whiskey and whispered to the quiet night, "For 10 cents, that wasn't bad at all." Then I smiled, not because I'd won, but because justice had. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen, a power-hungry neighbor, or someone who thought they could silence you, trust me, you're not alone. Sometimes, the smallest act of courage can expose the biggest lie. So tell me, have you ever had your own HOA story, or seen someone get the revenge they deserved? I'd love to hear it. Share your story in the comments below.